Hello, everybody. This is How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games. You have Dan and John here talking about everybody's favorite checker games. Not checkers, just kidding. It's backgammon.
Hey guys, how's everyone doing? Living out this quarantine life.
Yeah, we are making the best of what we have, coming to you guys from on a live Zoom call. So forgive us for any quality drops. But to be honest, the recording equipment wasn't that good to begin with, so this is probably fine. Yeah, so we can get right into it. So backgammon, another game played with checkers. Great to play it with your grandpa while you're drinking coffee. Dan, when do you play backgammon?
I play it with my wife and my mother-in-law. And honestly, I do not have a great record. They're both pretty darn good. But always fun. What makes it fun, I think, is that it's a combination of luck and skill. So even if you're a bad player playing against a good player, you'll occasionally win, and vice versa.
Yeah, and you might even be a better player than your mother-in-law. You never know. You can always just blame it on the luck.
That's true.
Yeah. So backgammon is it's actually kind of like chess. It's been played for a very long time. There's evidence of backgammon being played as far back as 3000 BC in India and ancient Mesopotamia. So it's got a lot of history to it. It's one of the few racing dice games that survived into the 21st century, and it's still being played today. In fact, backgammon has seen developments as early as recently as 1960s. In 1960s, I think it was Prince Alexander Obolensky who decided to bring backgammon back into the forefront with a major international tournament. He brought together tons of players, the top players in the world, as well as even royalty, because it was a popular game among royalty in Europe and the Middle East for this tournament, and it kind of brought backgammon back into people's minds. So much so that a certain Playboy Mansion owner, Hugh Hefner, got wildly into the game himself. In fact, it was known that Hugh would have backgammon parties at the Playboy Mansion. So he was really into it. But yeah, so this game's been around a long time, but that's not to say it's been extremely popular the whole time. But it has seen a bit of a resurgence in the last 50 to 100 years. So, there was the establishment of an international federation for backgammon recently. I think it was 2009. So really this game is, it's come a long way, but it still has a long ways to go too. So, be ready to see backgammon being played for many, many years to come. But yeah,
so one of the oldest surviving games and an up and comer.
Yeah, it's got kind of best of both worlds.
Very cool. And once again, we apologize for any sort of delays and talkovers that happen. That's just sort of a function of what we're doing. But we want to give you the best experience as our listeners. So one thing that we are starting to do with this very episode is we're actually going to segment our episodes sort of more intentionally. So what we're going to do next is John and I are going to very quickly read through the rules of backgammon, give you a quick refresher if it's been a while since you've played, real lightning round type stuff. And then after that, we're going to get more into strategy. So if you feel great about the rules right now and you just want to skip over to strategy, go right ahead, hit that skip button. Otherwise, here we go with the rules blitz.
Alrighty, welcome to Rules Blitz, where we read off the rules really, really fast. Today we're doing backgammon. Here we go, Dan.
All right, backgammon is a game for 2 players, played on a board consisting of 24 narrow triangles called points.
The points are numbered from 1 to 24 in a C pattern.
The 6 points on the tail of the C closest to you are your home board. Points on the opposite tail are your opponent's home board.
The 12 points in between constitute the outer board.
Each player has 15 checkers of his own color.
The object of the game is to move all your checkers into your own home board and then bear them off. The first player to bear off all their checkers wins the game.
Each turn, the turn player rolls 2 dice. That player then moves their checkers based on the dice.
You can split up the roll between checkers or move the same checker twice.
You cannot move a checker onto a space occupied by 2 or more opposing checkers.
A point occupied by a single checker of either color is called a blot. If an opposing checker lands on your blot, the blot is hit and placed on the bar.
Anytime you have 1 or more checkers on the bar, your first obligation is to enter those checkers onto the opposing home board.
A checker is entered by moving it to an open point corresponding to one of the numbers on the rolled dice.
If you have 1 or more checkers on the bar, you cannot move any in-play checkers until all of your checkers have been entered from the bar.
Once you have moved all of your 15 checkers into your home board, you may commence bearing off.
You bear off a checker by rolling a number that corresponds to the point on which the checker resides, and then removing that checker from the board. For example, rolling a 6 permits the player to remove a checker from the 6 points.
All right, and that's what you need to know about backgammon. This has been Rules Blitz.
All right, we hope you enjoyed our very first edition of Rules Blitz. So now we're going to talk strategy, and to kick us off, we're just going to go over some key terms real quick. So we're going to talk about the different types of games that exist first. So John, here I see the race, I see a holding game, and I see in between. So you want to describe kind of what a race is versus a holding game?
Okay, sure. So a race happens when all of your pieces get on the other side of the opponent's pieces, in a sentence. That might not be the easiest way to explain it, but basically once there's no chance for either player to hit the other player's pieces, then the game becomes a race, and it's just a matter of who can get their checkers bared off first. There's no real strategy other than how you bear off your checkers.
Well, you got to work on your dice rolling, though.
Yeah, exactly. You do have to work on your dice rolling. Yeah. So in contrast, a holding game is something where instead of all the checkers being past each other and there's almost no contact, a holding game is characterized by the conflict of you or your opponent holding a point deep in the other player's board. So when you say you make a point on your opponent's five point, so deep in their board, sometimes your best option is to leave that point there until the end of the game and try and snipe opposing pieces as they enter their opponent's home board. And so that would be characteristic of a holding game. And now an in-between game is kind of just what I would use to describe when the game is kind of in a mixed state and you're not necessarily just holding a point. There's a lot of hitting back and forth, but you might eventually settle into a holding game, or at any moment you can break contact and kind of get your pieces past each other with an advantage. Then you can turn into a race. But it's kind of just an in-between game. I think most in-between games eventually settle into a race or a holding game.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And so, but I think both of these types of games are really dependent on this concept called the pip count. And you want to explain to us what a pip is, Dan?
Well, I believe I might get this wrong. A pip, I want to say, is it's one of the spaces. And so basically, if you have, let's say you had 5 checkers on the board, and one had 10 spaces to go, and another had 12, and then, I guess, yeah, let's say one had 10 to go, and the other 4 had 12 to go, then your pip count would be 12 times 4 plus 10 times 1, which is equal to 58, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's
the
correct.
idea, right?
Yeah, that's what the pip count is. But a pip specifically just to clarify, a pip specifically is the individual dot on a die. So when you roll a 5, you have 5 pips on the face of the die. So that's where the name comes from. And the pip count is a way of saying how many pips do you need to roll before you could bear off all of your checkers.
Got it.
And so, yes,
That
pip count pip count's important because it lets you know. It's like the simplest way to see if you're ahead in a game. If your pip count's lower, that means you're closer to bearing off all of your pieces. And so, in that case, I think that a race would actually be favorable to you if you're ahead in the pip count. Yeah.
Right. Right, because if you have more pips to roll before you get everybody home, you don't want to be in a race because that means on average you're going to lose unless you happen to roll much better pip counts than your opponent.
Right. That's true. Yeah. So this is kind of the idea behind the race. Know your pip count, and pip count is a hard thing to count. I mean, if you just think about it, there's 15 checkers. They're everywhere. If you're playing online, you can easily get a perfect pip count. But if you're just playing on a board, ain't nobody got time to do all that math.
Right.
It's not worth it. But you can kind of keep this in mind. I think it's pretty easy to see in general who's ahead in pip count when you're playing. Yeah.
So now, can you talk a little more about why it's good to? So I think the natural impulse among a lot of beginning players, myself included, is to get your own checkers forward. Like if you can get your own checkers forward safely, then you should do that. But as you somewhat alluded to, if you're behind in the pip count, you don't necessarily want to do this. You might want to move some of your more advanced checkers instead of moving forward checkers that are on a point that you're holding deep within your opponent's territory.
Yeah. So, I think that the important thing to think about when is that it's kind of similar to other games like chess, where if you're behind in the game, or if you're ahead in the game, you want to simplify the game. Like in chess, if you're ahead, you want to make more trades, right? It's kind of similar in backgammon. If you're ahead, you want to simplify and get the game into a race. If you're behind, you want to make the game as complicated as possible, so to speak. That way, you give your opponent more chances to mess up, essentially. Because just by pure luck, they're going to win most of the time if you just leave it up to chance, or if you just leave it up to a race. But if you can outplay them by playing a holding game where you keep your points in there, you keep your checkers in their home, in the back of the board, as opposed to in your front, you can make things a lot more complicated for your opponent as they try to return their own pieces to the home board. And so in this, you can give yourself opportunities to bridge the gap in the pip count. And
Got
also,
it. So you want to put a thorn in their side.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing to think about is that instead of, like you said, instead of moving your back pieces up, you'd be moving your more forward pieces into different positions. And the thing about that is that you can use that to build up your own home board into a powerful setup that can make it really hard for your opponent to come back if they ever have to leave their pieces open to being hit.
Right. So I think that is getting into another term that we wanted to talk about briefly, if you think we're there already, but maybe we talk about what a prime is.
Yeah, that's a good time. Okay, so do you want to take this one?
I will try. So a prime is basically when you have your own checkers established on consecutive points. That's the simplest definition, right? So, if I have checkers on the 5-point and also checkers on the 6-point, then, multiple checkers on each one, then that's a prime. And obviously, that example doesn't seem very important, but when you talk about getting, 3 or 4 spaces in a row occupied by your own checkers, then that means it makes it very difficult for your opponent to sort of leapfrog your checkers because, they can't land on a given space if your checkers occupy it. So, in the example I gave where you're occupying 4 consecutive spaces, then that means your opponent needs to get a 5 or a 6 to pass any checkers over that prime. So you heavily reduce your opponent's ability to move forward in the game, and that can be very important, especially in the situation that John brought up where, you get a capture late in the game and you have a very well-established home board controlling most of the spaces, so that makes it very difficult for them to get back into the game after that capture.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest, or it's kind of a no-brainer once you realize it. But the prime is something that can be really powerful, but it's only powerful if there are opposing checkers behind it.
Yep.
There's no point in making a prime to stop no checkers from passing.
Right.
However, it can be a nice threat to have a prime set up, and that makes it so your opponent can't leave their their checkers vulnerable. Right. So a prime can be as much of as it is an actual detriment to your opponent.
Right. Okay. So do you want to talk about opening strategy, or do you have one more thing to say?
Let's keep going on prime. There's a few more things we can talk about.
Cool.
At least I know of, and it's that there are certain primes that are more attainable than others, and they're also stronger. The best primes that I know of generally involve your own 5 and 6 point. And this is kind of getting into a rules of thumb territory here, I guess. But I would say that so you want a prime to be somewhere where it's going to block a lot of things, but it's also difficult to set up a prime anywhere other than on your own home board or around your own home board. If you just think about how the checkers move and where they're placed to begin with. So not only the most common prime involves the 5 and the 6 point, but it's also the most powerful one because it will completely shut your opponent down if they get get a checker put on the bar. So you can keep that in mind when you're trying to make your primes, and know that you really want to include these points that will make it really tough for your opponent to enter pawns back in, or enter checkers back in, and get those checkers out.
Right.
Yeah. So that's enough about primes. We can move on to opening strategy now.
Sure. Yeah, and also one last thing about primes. I don't know if you agree with this, but like the prime as a concept, I feel like is one of the most useful things you can have, and probably what separates, a novice player from an intermediate player is, just simply knowing the importance and how powerful a prime is.
Then knowing how much knowing how important it is to have one of your own, but also how scary it is if your opponent looks like they're putting one together.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about opening.
Okay, great.
All right. So you've got a couple points down here.
Yeah. So my first point kind of ironically says, if you can make a point, do it. When we're talking about the opening strategy, I'm specifically talking about the very first roll of the game. So when you start a game of backgammon, both players roll one die, and whoever rolls higher gets to go first. If you roll doubles, if you each roll the same on your dice, then you roll again. So essentially, the first move of any game cannot be a doubles roll, which means that this opening move it can be very unique. There's only a few different patterns you can make with it. But a lot of these opening moves, if you can make a point that you didn't already have, it's just going to put you way ahead. For example, if you can make your own 7-point, such as on I think it's a 6-1 roll, opening roll, where that you make the 7-point, and boom, now you already have a 3' set up on your board. That's very strong. The only thing really stronger than that as far as making points goes would be rolling something like a 3-1 where you can make your own 5-point on the first turn, which is just fantastic. It already puts you well ahead in the game. Mm-hmm. So if your opening roll lets you make a point that you didn't already have, then it's almost never a mistake. Now I say almost never because there are some rules that involve making your own 2-point, which means putting 2 checkers on the 2-point right in front of the opposing checkers. And now that's, it's not a bad move in itself, but the problem is that I think when you have that roll, you've rolled something like a 6-4.
Yeah.
And there are much better things to do with the 6-4, which we can get to later.
Would you say the reason that the reason that it's not too great is it's easy for those 2 checkers of your opponents that it's blocking to get past that 2-point?
Right. So not only is it going to be easier for them to get past that 2-point right off the bat, but also for any blots that you hit later in the game, they can easily enter past the 2-point. So your 2-point essentially just serves to take one of their options away when they're trying to enter a pawn or a checker. Sorry, keep making that mistake. But
all right.
A 2-point doesn't do much in the way of blocking any actual movement. So it's not nearly as good as a 4-point or especially the 5-point, because those are further back.
Got it.
Right.
All right. So what if you can't make a point?
Well, if you can't make a point, I guess you just cry. There's definitely other good things to do. One of the more underrated things that I only really found to be useful once I started looking into the game more and reading a lot about the game is the idea of bringing up builders. Now, builders are essentially checkers. The most common way to bring up a builder is to move one of the checkers from, I believe it's the 13-point, which is kind of in the one that starts off with 5 checkers and is kind of in the middle of the board. If you can bring up a checker from that point, even if you leave it undefended or you leave it as a blot, it can still be very useful to have. Not on that turn specifically, but it's great to have it for later turns when you're trying to make points in your own home board.
Okay. So I guess your opponent doesn't really have a lot of striking power if you move one of your checkers from that 13-point, because you're still probably moving that to your outer board, and they just have their 2 backmost checkers, which more likely than not will not be able to capture that checker that you just moved from the 13 point on the next turn, right?
Right. Yeah, you're really, you leave a blot on your first turn, which seems like, obviously, like, why would you want to do that, right? But it's really actually not that likely to be hit, especially when you consider that you already own the 6 point and you own 8 point.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
the roles that your opponent would have to hit are very specific. Not only that, but what do they really gain from hitting you? They haven't developed their home board at all, so you can enter pretty freely the next turn.
Mm-hmm.
You can just put your pawn back, and then you have and then you lose a little bit in the pip count race, but it's not the end of the world. The game's still fresh, so it's a risk that's, I think, well worth taking. So bringing up builders is something you definitely want to think about when you're discussing your opening moves, especially in the first move, but also in general. It's good to have builders before your opponent really builds up their own points in their home board to make it scary for you to get hit. So there's a couple more, and we'll talk about it more when we get into the strategy of hitting and when to hit, when to leave your checkers vulnerable and when to protect them. We'll talk about that in more depth a little bit later. But the other priorities for your opening moves should be to either get your back checkers out from your opponent's home board, or to do quote unquote safe moves. So moves they can move a checker from a point you own to another point you also own. So these two other concepts, I would say advancing your back checkers seems like something that you've been really interested in, Dan. I don't necessarily know enough. Like I haven't played enough games where I focus on getting my back checkers out of the home board, to like understand how powerful it is. But what I do know is that if you can get them out early, it's considered to be very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know we're talking about what to do if you can't make a point, but I think since we're talking about these back checkers, another concept that would be useful to bring up right now is that of an advanced anchor.
Right.
Yeah. So basically that, an anchor, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is any point you own in your opponent's home board, or would this be your own home board?
Oh yeah, that sounds good to me. Your opponent's home board.
Yeah, your opponent's home board. So, right, like at the very beginning, you own the 24 point with those two checkers that start, at the very, very back, and they have the longest to go for you. So being able to advance those, even 2 or 3 spaces up, has a huge advantage for future play in the game. For a lot of reasons that can be seen. Like it's not as easy to block you from exiting, or it's easier to pick off the opponent's players, from the outer board as they come around, your opponent's checkers, that is. Mm-hmm. But, even, I think there's probably even some benefits that aren't so easy to see. But, if you look at any sort of computer analyzing backgammon positions, all other things being equal, you're just much better off in terms of your chances to win if you can advance that anchor 2 or 3 or 4 spaces. And of course, if you can move 1 on your first move, even though you might be exposing yourself, you give yourself a better chance to build it. And like, if you get taken, then, like you said, it's fine because it's early in the game and those were the least advanced of your checkers anyway. It's a kind of low risk, high reward play.
Right. Not only that, but if your opponent decides to hit one of your hit a checker in their own home board, they better be able to make a point on that same on that same. Otherwise, you can just re-enter your checker immediately, capturing one of their most advanced checkers. So it's a really, oftentimes it's just the worst thing they can do to hit one of the checkers that you moved up on your first turn. So in this case, it's actually somewhat safe to just kind of advance your back checkers a little bit to try and get them up to a place where you'd like an advanced anchor. It's going to be really hard for your opponent to hit back. You hit the nail on the head as far as why you want to advance your back checkers. You want the opportunity to make your opponent's 5 point, because you kind of have control over your opponent in that position. You can snipe their checkers as they come in. They might have trouble entering or getting their checkers into their own home board because you're blocking a spot. If you ever get a piece taken, if you ever get a checker put on the bar, then you can re-enter it right back onto the 5 point or something similar, right back onto your anchor. And that's just really nice to have. You can't really ever get trapped like that.
Cool. All right. Should we move to rules of thumb?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we've already kind of gone into the advantage of the 5 or the 5 point or the opponent's 5, which is also technically the 20 point for you, but we'll refer to it as the opponent's 5. And this point is far and away the most important point in the game. And I say point, but there's really 2 of them, and that's just because it's symmetric. So for each player, these 2 points are the most important points. So Dan, what do you think about the 5 point?
I mean, I think we've talked a lot about it. Really, like it depending on which direction you're looking, you either block your opponent from making advances out of their own home board, or out of your home board. I'm mixing that up a lot, but I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Or you give yourself a nice outpost to snipe your opponent's checkers as they come around. So basically, whether you're ahead or behind in the game, it can be a really nice tactical point to have. It's just it's another example of just being a thorn in the side of your opponent, even if they're well ahead of you.
Right. The game can always kind of fall apart if you have their 5 point.
Right.
If they roll really bad, then they could end up having to leave a checker exposed, and boom, you're back in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we can kind of talk about it, the 5 point, because we got the 5 point. Well, what about the 6 point? What about the 4 point? And these are, again, they're not bad points. You really would like to have them too, but I think it's about priorities. And why is the 5 point better than the 6 point? Well, simply put, it's in the perfect spot, whereas the 6 point is, 1 spot off. It's just a little bit too far out as far as on the defensive side. When you are trying to keep your opponent's checkers in your home board, it gives your opponent a little bit too much room if you only have the 6 point. Yes. I actually might take that one back. It's kind of hard to say why the 6 point is that much is worse. I can tell you from the point of view of having your opponent's 6 point, I know why it's worse. It's because it's a little bit easier for your opponent's checkers to leapfrog in from their 13 point.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not as powerful because the opponent can have a little bit more leeway. It's getting past your 6 point into their home board.
Mm-hmm. Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, some of the concepts we're talking about, maybe even if it's not clear immediately why it's better, there is this excellent website that goes through a lot of examples, and if you just look at any computer simulations in terms of like this position exists and how good is this position relative to this position, it just becomes very clear that the 5 point is better.
Mm-hmm.
We can include a link to this website, that Checker Play website, in the show notes for people to go take a look at.
Yeah. Yeah, there are several good online resources for backgammon, which is great to help you learn the game, in addition to our lovely podcast. And so we'll be including links to all of the resources that we've used in putting this together, because they certainly helped us out. We still are a bunch of backgammon chumps, but at least now we've done some reading.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will be a while before we actually get to play backgammon, I'm sure.
Right. Yeah. It's playing board games in person might not be the most smart thing due to all the complications arising from COVID-19, but thanks to online games and thanks to online resources, that doesn't mean you can't still play and also get better at these games and perhaps learn how to beat. So
you want to make your quarantine productive? Online backgammon.
Or just listen to this podcast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, moving on, we'll talk about the bar.
Moving on, yes. Let's talk about the bar. So, why is the bar such a big deal?
So having a point on the bar, I feel like when you play your first game of backgammon, like whenever you're playing a board game and someone captures your piece or something like that, you tend to get the sense that it's a bad thing. Just has a negative connotation to it. And you may even, when you're first playing backgammon, you realize, okay, now this checker's all the way back at the start of the board. So that sucks. Now I have to get it all the way back around. So immediately that's a big deal with having a point on the bar, is that you probably lost, or that you definitely lost some pip counts. Your pip count went up when your piece was put on the bar. That's the immediate thing that you can notice. The problem with the bar is that that's not all. There's also an incredible positional component to it, where sometimes being put on the bar, you might even prefer it. But most of the time, it can put you in a very scary position. And that just depends on how your opponent has developed their home board. So you can kind of talk a little bit more about that, Dan.
Sure. So, like we said in the rules, if you're on the bar, if you have at least one checker on the bar and you can't move everything that you have on the bar back into play, you can't make any moves. So, if your opponent has a 6 prime, this is the absolute worst example, and you've basically lost if this is the case. But if your opponent has a 6 prime on their own home board and you're on the bar, you literally can't get it. You have to skip an entire turn, and you probably have to skip multiple turns, as they keep entering their checkers they keep bearing off their checkers. I think a backgammon, what a backgammon is, or one of those terms, the different ways that you can lose is, your opponent has bared off everything and you still have someone on the bar. I may or may not be correct on that, but
that's the backgammon. Yeah.
that's a backgammon. Yeah. So,
Mhm.
I mean, it can cause real problems. I mean, it also, like you said, can be an asset. So let's say your opponent, is starting to bear off checkers and like, they're forced to leave one open and you happen to have a guy on the bar and then you just snipe the one that they left open and now it has to go all the way back around the board. That might be a good thing. But, for the most part, I think the later in the game that you get pushed to the bar, the worse it tends to be for you because, the more established your opponent can be, with setting up their prime around their own home board.
And I think another thing that I hate about having my pieces on the bar is that you have to use one of your die rolls to put them back on, which means that you only have one roll to work with. So for example, if your opponent their opponent can leave a blot that's, for example, 7 points away from your nearest checker, and it's completely safe because you can't hit it. You have to enter your piece from the bar next turn. Overall, you become a lot less likely to be threatening to your opponent because you have to use one of your moves to put your checker back on the board. At least, well, and this is assuming you only have one on the bar. If you have two checkers on the bar, then unless you're rolling doubles, you're really not doing anything that turn, and your opponent can play as reckless as they want, which is huge because in backgammon, taking a risk that pays off can really set you ahead in the game. Often it's just that there's really big risks, like the leaving your checkers blotted can have such huge negative consequences that it can keep people from taking risks. But when they have the opportunity to, they can just get way too far ahead in the game.
Right.
And so leaving your pieces on the bar is just the easiest way to let your opponent do whatever they want.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not just about like what you can't do because you're on the bar. It's also, I mean, from hearing everything you said, it seems like it's much more about what your opponent can get away with doing because you're on the bar.
Yeah, I would say that's a good way to put it. It's like a concept that you and I both learned about recently, called duplication, where in some cases you may want to avoid risk altogether, right? You might want to leave your checkers completely protected, but sometimes you have to leave a checker unprotected, and say your opponent can reach that checker with the roll of a 4, and say, so now that you have that checker unprotected, it really doesn't hurt you too much to leave other checkers unprotected that can also be reached with a 4. And so this kind of concept can apply to the bar because say your opponent can only enter a pawn with like a roll of a 3 or a 2 or something like that. Then you can put your pieces safely 2 or 3 points away from your opponent's pieces, and know that even if they roll a 2 or a 3, they're unlikely to be able to hit you. So yeah, it's a real pain in the butt. And of course, every time, even if your opponent only has 2 or 3 points made in their own home board, there's still a good chance that you just don't get to move that turn because you didn't roll the right number to enter your pawn, your checker.
There's nothing more frustrating.
Yep, nothing more frustrating than losing turns just because you didn't roll a 3, a 4, or a 6.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems so easy, and statistically, you're not that unlikely to roll it, but it's a game of luck.
It happens.
And it happens. It happens a lot because you roll a lot each game.
Yeah, and it happens more than you as a human will expect it to happen. So, I have a 33% chance of not getting in, you know, like, and you roll it and you don't get in, you feel like, oh, that's so, that's BS. Like that shouldn't have happened. But, in reality, we expect it to happen a lot less than it actually does.
Right.
When you talk about probability.
Yeah. As soon as we see like less than 50%, we sort of just assume that we're entitled to whatever, to the outcome that we want.
Yeah.
But, 33% is a pretty solid chance of losing a turn.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And that's,
so I think, is that it on the bar, do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the next topic sort of dovetails with this nicely, but since we just talked about the bar, we should also talk about when to hit. So like when to put your opponent on the bar, perhaps when is it worth it to leave your own checker vulnerable after hitting your opponent onto the bar, and the dynamics there. So do you want to kick this off?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about it. So this is one of those concepts that I think is what really is going to differentiate an experienced player from a beginner. And that's to say that for a lot of this, you have to learn how to judge each situation a little bit differently. So all we can do is, again, give you some rules of thumb. And so when you're considering whether to hit your opponent's checker, there are a few things you want to consider. One, how many tips is it going to set them back? Two, how and two, I think it's just one. I think it's just two, actually, to be honest. Two, how is your home board developed? Do you have points on your home board, or do you have blots on your home board? Because having blots on your home board would make it pretty. You'd be taking your life into your own hands by hitting an opponent's checker while you have a blot. Even close to your home board, say it's like the 7 point, having a blot there would be pretty risky. And so you have to consider this when you're thinking about hitting someone. I guess the last thing I would consider is whether your opponent has any checkers in your home board as well. Because if your opponent already has one checker in your home board, then you're kind of giving them the opportunity to make a point, make an advanced anchor in your home board by hitting them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it could actually backfire on you to hit them, because then you have to deal with this point potentially that you wouldn't have had to worry about otherwise. Yeah. And so obviously I think that like the kind of the tip count, if you're going to hit a piece that's really well developed on your opponent's side and set them back a ton of tips, then it might be worth it to allow them to kind of set up a point in your home board, just because it helps you so much in the tip count area. But this is kind of, from my perspective, it's where play style and experience come in, because you have to judge like these three things. And so what do you think about when you're deciding when to hit?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I've always thought about tip count. Basically, if I can use one of my not so far advanced checkers and take one of my opponent's checkers close to the home board, I almost always do it. Obviously, like, I look at my home board too. I think it's usually pretty unlikely that I have vulnerable checkers in my own home board that could get taken out by a bad entry roll. But I've always looked at that too. I also weigh the options against what else I have the opportunity of doing. And I think we'll talk more about this later too, on like, choosing between two good options. But, if I have a chance to like send my opponent to the bar, but like I also have a chance to, shore up the 5-point, like 9 times out of 10, I'm probably going to choose shore up the 5-point because, that's a better strategic move. That's kind of what goes through my head.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The opportunity cost is a big deal, because sometimes it just will easily be the best move you have, but other times you'll be considering whether to hit a piece or whether to make a point, or even like whether to make a run with one of your one of the checkers in your backfield, right? So there's always, as in a lot of these games, there's always a ton to consider. But as we've talked about before, putting your opponent on the bar puts yourself generally in a very nice position to do a lot more things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you said it before, but this is another one of the things that separates, novices from more experienced players is I feel like as a novice, my gut instinct was always, I can take you, so I'm going to take you, because I got a good roll or whatever. And that impulse to take is just so strong that, but, once you've played a little more and, you realize that that's not the object of the game,
right.
then, you have much more of a big picture look at things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a very fun and advantageous thing to do. But it's not always the right answer.
Right.
There are circumstances in which you wouldn't. And the converse of this question is when to leave your own checkers hanging. So when do you think it's okay to just leave a checker as a blot?
When your opponent has 2 checkers on the bar.
Well, that's certainly an easy way to do it. Easy decision.
Yeah.
But what if they roll? What if they roll double 4s, Dan, and then they take your piece anyway?
Checkmate. I think, this is something that I've, thought about a lot, like in sort of a non-polished way when I play too. But I think about like, number one, like simply how likely is it that my opponent will make a roll that will allow them to take this checker. But then I also think about like, would it even be a good idea for them to take this checker if they have the opportunity to, so like some of the things we've talked about already, like if they have a weak home board with a couple blocks in it, then like I actually want them to take me because then I'll, probably be able to screw them up in some way. And I think, well, the best thing for them to do in that case would be to not take me. So that means that I'm safe by doing that. We've talked some about those kinds of situations. But yeah, I kind of look at it from my opponent's point of view.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. I think definitely knowing whether you're going to get hit or like whether you should expect to get hit and what the consequences would be has got to be the biggest factor. Probably the biggest factor in like deciding to leave a piece hanging. The other factor is weighing the first part against how much you can actually gain from leaving it hanging.
Right.
And sometimes it doesn't, this is where the chance element's going to come in a lot. And you're going to have probably a lot of friends who are playing you and they see you leave a piece vulnerable and they're going to say, oh, that's so dumb. I'm just gonna take you. And then, honestly, maybe they do, because they got the right roll. But it's one of those things where in the long run, you actually gain a lot from having that pawn or that checker up. They might, you definitely get gloated on, and your opponent might brag about being a best player, right?
Can you just explain real quick about what you mean by the long run?
Yeah, okay. So the long run, I'm thinking like in the next 2 or 3 turns, with that checker that you left hanging, you hope to do something really good with it. For example, to make a point in your own home board is the easiest one that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you need to have like a good plan with the checker, maybe. Maybe that's like the easiest
yeah. Well, I think
like,
and I think the builder concept you brought up before is a good example of this. Like when you can't get a point on that first roll, you move something from that 13 point in the hopes that like in subsequent rolls you might be able to match that and get a point, establish a point, and you're balancing that against, well, it's really not too likely that they're going to roll a double 4 and capture you on the first turn. So like you said, it's a calculated risk. You weigh risk against reward. And also, like you said, sometimes it's not going to pan out. Sometimes your opponent's going to get exactly the roll they need. But that does not mean that it was not a good decision to begin with. And, where I thought you were going when you said the long run is, if you were hypothetically to play 1,000 games in a row and each game you made this decision that you're about to make, 600 out of those 1,000 times you would win, and maybe 400 out of the times you would lose, but it still means that this is the best way forward.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a game influenced by the law of large numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that's part of what makes it addicting.
Yeah, exactly. What makes it addicting is that you can get absolutely trashed by someone who's, not a great player, but you can also beat someone who's a great player.
Yeah.
And it's kind of good. It feels kind of good to have that sort of ability to always feel like you're in a game. Whereas with something
and
like
the game is never truly over until it's over.
The game's never over until it's over. And also, the simple fact is that no 2 games are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I should have pulled up this number, but I think there's been some calculation on the amount of possible board states in backgammon. It's incredible.
Yeah.
It is. I think it's like well past the trillions or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. So no, you're not gonna play two games that go the same way. It's just not how it's gonna go.
Yeah. No, you won't.
But that doesn't mean. So that means when your play doesn't work out exactly like you thought it would, it doesn't mean it's the wrong play. On the other hand,
exactly.
if your play works out, if your risk works out perfectly, it doesn't mean you should have taken it.
Right. All right. So speaking of risk taking in general, I think we should touch on what this means when you're ahead versus when you're behind. When you're behind, you have more to gain and more to lose. So if a gamble, it's a gamble. Maybe you have a negative expected value, but you're already behind anyway, and so maybe there's a 20% chance that you establish this great point in your opponent's home board the next turn, and there's like a 90% chance that they're able to take you, but you're already so far behind that it doesn't make sense to just play it safe, and you go with the gamble. But the same kind of moves, if you're way ahead, would just be idiotic. So, I mean, it's just another dimension of weighing risk and reward.
Right. I think we actually touched on a very similar concept in our Monopoly podcast.
Oh, yes. We did.
Where we talk about how you have to look at paths to winning, not just paths to looking good in the short term. And so, yeah, I think you're right that in backgammon, when you're losing, you have to do the moves that can actually get you a win.
Right.
Not the move like even in the best case I'm still losing this game unless I roll perfect from here on out.
Like I don't care if you lose by 5 checkers or 10 checkers, you know, you're still going to lose. But if you have a 1/100th chance of winning by 1 checker and a 99% chance of losing by, I guess you only have 15. So let's say 13 checkers, you should definitely take the risk in that scenario.
Right. Yeah. And we can talk a little bit about there's one situation in which that argument kind of isn't true in backgammon specifically because you can actually double lose in backgammon.
Yeah, exactly.
So to speak. You can get gammoned and you can get backgammon.
Right.
But so we'll talk about that in a little bit though. But yeah, and so I think another thing to remember is that this is obviously going to go in the other way, right? So if you find yourself ahead in a backgammon game, I mean, heck, if you're ahead in the pip count, then why would you ever risk getting hit if you didn't have to? You might as well just play it safe and play it towards a race. Get your pieces out of harm's way as much as you can. Don't worry too much about attacking your opponent's pieces because you're already ahead.
Right.
Just kind of coast the game out if you happen to find yourself in a good position. If you find yourself in a bad position, you're looking for every opportunity in which it might go wrong for your opponent, even if it's just a small chance.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't get greedy. Don't try to win by 100. Doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. I think that's like a big deal is that you really, when you're ahead, they have to roll really well to get back in it.
Yeah.
If you play perfectly, even if your rolls are like subpar, you know, your opponent still has to roll above par to beat you most times.
Exactly. So we should probably wrap it up pretty quick, but what we have left is, so we have tough calls, duplication, and diversification, and then we're getting into the doubling rules, which we wanted to touch on really quick. So I'll just briefly touch on diversification, and then we can get to the other two, and then we'll wrap up. So
sounds good.
Yeah. So like you said, duplication is when you want to give your opponent, you know, basically your opponent needs one roll to do 2 or more different things, so they can't do them all at once. Diversification is the opposite, in which you sort of craft your own board so that many different kinds of rolls will do something good for you. Even maybe the same thing or maybe multiple good things, you know, but regardless, to the extent that you can give yourself options like that. Oh, well, if I roll a 7, I can take here. If I roll an 8, I can set up this 5-point. Or if I roll a 13, then I can, you know, etc. Like, you can't roll a 13. That was stupid. But
yeah, I was like, Dan, we haven't been talking for that long, have we?
Yeah. Although that one dude who had this as his epigram could have rolled a 13. But
right. Oh yeah, that was a story. maybe we can link the story to it. Essentially, it goes that a Byzantine emperor was playing a game of backgammon, or a variant of backgammon, where you threw three dice instead of two. And in one of his games, he rolled a set of 3 dice that was so bad that it forced him to leave 8 blots on his own board.
Yeah.
And he was his luck was so bad in this game that the game ended up making it onto his epigram. So this game is engraved forever that this emperor played. Now I don't really know why he would engrave, as an emperor, he would engrave a game of him that probably ended with him losing. But,
terribly.
Maybe he was a humble emperor.
Maybe. Yeah. So anyway, that's the idea of diversification. I don't think I have any specific examples, but just as a concept, you should keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to think of it is just that this is why you bring up a builder, because it diversifies your board a bit and lets you make plays off of a lot more rolls.
Right.
Yeah, that's the strength of a builder.
Sure. Okay, so tough calls. I have a chance to establish the 5-point on my opponent's home board, or I can capture, or I can advance my anchor. How do I make the decision on what to do? And spoiler alert, there's no one answer.
Right. Yeah, I think what's important is to know kind of what to consider when you're making these tough calls. And so, like I kind of brought up with the when to hit when we were talking earlier, you want to consider a few different things. These are what you want to consider. One, again, the pip count is the main one. If you're ahead, you choose maybe the more defensive option, such as making a point, as opposed to going for an aggressive take. So that the pip count can inform you on how aggressive you should be between 2 different good options. But other things to consider would be, it's going to be looking at your own board position, looking at which one fits in better. Like, is it looking like you're going to have to play a holding game, or is it looking like you might be able to set up a prime? You kind of have to look 10 steps ahead, which you can't really do in backgammon, but you have to look into the future a little bit and see, like, how do I see this game playing out? Do you want to split your goals? Do you want to, like, go for a half aggressive option, or, like, when you generally were playing a defensive game? Maybe not. Maybe you just stick to playing defensive, and that's how you make your decision. Yeah.
Cool.
That's what they usually do. I mean, again, we're not the best people to ask necessarily, because we're relatively inexperienced, but these are kind of things I consider.
Yeah. And again, if you want more in-depth analysis and specific positions, we will have some good links in the show notes to go. There's this website called checkerplay.com, which is very thorough, has a lot of good positions to go through. All right, let's talk about doubling. The rules, when to offer, when to accept. This will be really quick, but we can't talk about backgammon without at least touching on the idea of the doubling cube. So, John, I was wondering if you could go through more of maybe how it got started and sort of the mechanics of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, so this won't be a rules blitz, but it'll be sort of a mini blitz. Doubling was it was actually invented in the 1920s. It wasn't added to the game until relatively recently in New York gambling clubs. And so the doubling cube is something that you use when you're playing match play. So you're not just playing one game of backgammon, but you're playing, say, to like a best of 5, right? Or actually, what they would say with the doubling cube is you play, for example, to 10 points. Then with the doubling cube, each game starts off as counting as 1 point. So if you win that game, you get the point, and it's the first person to 10 points. Now that seems like a lot of points. However, before any player starts their turn and makes their roll, they can offer the doubling cube to their opponent. So the doubling cube starts off at 1, so signaling 1 point for the game. The first time you offer the doubling cube, it flips to 2. So the game would now be worth 2 points if the opponent accepts the doubling cube. They can either choose to accept it and now the game's worth 2 points, or they can say, nuh-uh, I don't want to play this game for twice the stakes, I just forfeit. Those are the only 2 options. Now later in the game, if the position changes or whatever, the opponent who accepted the cube can offer it back and double it again, so that the stakes are even higher, 4 instead of 2. And this can go on and on. I think there's a limit, upper limit to the number of the stakes. I think is 32, but
I think it's 64 actually.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, the dice starts at 2, huh? And ends at 64, not starts at 1.
Yeah.
Okay, but you get the gist. So basically, if you accept the doubling cube, the game's worth twice as much, and if you refuse it, you have to forfeit immediately. And so this adds this crazy ability of a player to get a win simply off of judging the board correctly, or even get more points out of their opponent simply by knowing the board state and knowing whether they have the advantage.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems to me like, obviously you want to offer when you are ahead, solidly ahead, I would say, and you'd want to accept when you think it's really unlikely to win. And I think in terms of when to offer what you should be thinking about, I'm assuming this is most of the same things we've been talking about, talking about pip count, talking about potential for primes, talking about holding down the 5, maybe 6 point, and just like assessing, taking inventory of what you have going for you, and making an informed decision. Now, I have no idea how to value and weight all of these things, and I don't know if you do or if we're going to get into that here.
No, yeah. The thing is, weighting all those things is something that's best left to a simulator. So
yeah, for sure.
Really, I think what's important to know, and another rule I forgot to mention is that if you manage to gammon your opponent in match play, then the stakes of the game are automatically doubled, so you get 2 points instead of 1 in a normal game. And if you backgammon your opponent, then I believe you get 4 times the stakes, although backgammon is extremely rare. So, but the gammon is relevant because, for example, if you get to be really ahead in a game, then it just makes sense for you to offer a doubling cube in general, because you'd rather have them forfeit the game now than leave it up to bad luck to screw you, right? And so the only thing is, if you're so far ahead that you think you'll gammon, it actually might not be in your best interest to offer the cube. So that's one thing to consider is how far ahead are you? Really, really, really far ahead to where there's no way they could come back. The only difference is whether you'll gammon them or not. Then I would say you don't even need to offer the cube, right?
Yeah. So really quick, a gammon is when you've bared off all of your checkers and your opponent still has some on the outer board. Is that right?
No, your opponent hasn't bared off a single checker.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah. They could have bared off a checker earlier and then you hit a checker or something like that. Yeah. Gammon is that they don't have a single checker bared off, and backgammon is that they have a checker on the bar.
Got it.
Right. Yeah. As for accepting and offering the die in more even situations, I think especially in the case of that, we're trying to teach people who are, not playing with experts, right? So when you're playing with someone, and you can offer the doubling cube to kind of assert that your position is better. And it's also important to remember your fundamentals and to look at the board whenever someone offers you a cube, and say, actually, I don't really think my position's that bad. I'll take that cube.
Definitely.
I think it's interesting to think about when to deny the cube as opposed to when to offer it. When not to accept the cube is more complicated, because if you don't accept it, then you automatically lose 1 point. But if you accept it, then you have a percent chance of losing 2 points, or of getting 2 points down, right?
Right.
And so if you think that, the game is around 50-50, then it's just makes sense for you to play it out, right?
Yeah.
If you think it's even 55-45 in their favor, you might still want to play it out, because, if you just think you're a little bit better player than them, right? Or, or if you're just feeling lucky, it's not always the right call to just fold when you're in a rough position. Because backgammon has a lot of chance in it.
A lot of chance involved.
Yeah. When you're ahead, though, I think it's generally a good, I don't know. I think it's just not a bad call. If you're more than, if it's 55-45, then, 55% chance of you winning, then I think it's up to you. It's a judgment call if you like to play aggressive. I think it's justified either way. But I think you have to wait till there's some sort of obvious shift in the board, or obvious shift in the state, and who's likely to win. Offering it willy-nilly seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's it.
That about wraps it up.
But yeah, this was fun. Thank you all for listening and being patient. And we will see you next time. And what we will talk about is to be determined. But stay tuned for the next episode, and we'll see you then. Yeah.
This has been How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games.